Documentation. Let's get into this topic. Hey Techno Studs, in this video we're going to talk about documentation, and the reason why I laugh is because it's kind of amazing how much goes into this and how many you'll find people on both sides of this. People who are a little anti-documentation and really just think that you should be making progress, and then people who are on the other side that just want to document all the time, or at least think that you should be documenting all the time. And the answer is somewhere in between. So let's get into this topic of documentation. All right, so in this video, we're going to be talking about why document. It is so critical that we do document things. So let's talk about documentation. Let's talk about some common network documentation that you would see or want to create. We're going to talk about some document guidelines. These are my guidelines. It's nothing official that's out there, but when I take documentation, because I've seen people go to the extreme with documentation or not do it correctly. So let's talk about documentation guidelines, and then we'll talk about some steps for this documentation that you would take to implement this different documentation. There have been many times when I've had an issue on my network and I've been trying to troubleshoot it and figure out what's going on. I take a look at a piece of equipment and I see maybe there's a high CPU on it. I'm like, well, that's strange. Why is there such a high CPU on it? And so I will assume that that is a problem. But the thing is I don't know, is it always at 80%? Or is it just happened to be 80% right now because of the issue that we're having? I don't know that information. So really what that boils down to is I need to have some sort of records beforehand of is that part of this how this piece of equipment operates, or is it unique right now? Is it different right now? So I can identify if things have changed or not. So that's one reason to document. There's other reasons as well. For instance, if a device died and you need to replace it, how are you going to replace it if you didn't know what the configurations were on that device? Or let's say somebody is out someday and there's an emergency and you need to tackle something and there is some knowledge that that person has that no one else has. Well, documentation can save the day. They can step in and you can look at the documentation, decipher what's going on, and be able to fix things. Or what happens when something happens and there's maybe a security incident and we don't know how far back this security incident goes. So we need documentation to know when we made certain changes to understand what the security ramifications of whatever happened is. So there's a whole host of reasons why. Another one would be is, let's say we fixed an issue and then we encounter the issue again. If we didn't document that fix, then we wouldn't know how to fix it again. So I can bring up time and time again why there's so many benefits to documentation. So you definitely should do documentation. And I'm going to say that most people don't do enough documentation. Probably 80–90% of the people out there don't do enough documentation. And so you drive it home. You say, you need to be documenting. You need to be, so it's very critical that you do this documentation step whenever you're rolling out a project, whenever you're fixing something, whenever you make a change, that you do this documentation step. But now that I say that, you have to document. It's so important. There's a whole host of reasons why you document. Now that I say that, I will also say that there are some people that want to just document like crazy, that put it as the #1 priority. Well, that's not the case either. You want your network to be up and running, and documentation kind of takes a back seat to some of these other priorities that happen as well. So you can actually get overemphasized with documentation, but I rarely see that happen. In fact, even the people that overemphasize the need for documentation and put it at such a high priority, I do find that they also are a lot of times they're the same people that don't document enough. And I'd say most of the time I run into cases where where there's not enough documentation that happens. There are also some problems with over documenting. There's this is a mess. If we have so much information and we can't find the information that we need, that's problematic. And if it's not organized, so there is a problem when we have way too much much documents, and maybe there's too much old information that's kind of cluttering things up, so we need to expire some of that. But like I say, most of the time I find people are in this not enough documentation. But there is this finding the right balance in between. Smaller businesses tend to go to the under documentation. The bigger businesses tend to go for more process oriented, and there's a reason, because there's some security that happens with that, and there's some ability to bounce back when there's issues and stuff. So there's a reason why they kind of gravitate towards the more documentation side on there. So you're going to have to adjust this for the different businesses and find what the right mix is, depending on the culture of the business. Are they move forward fast and fail fast, and then you come back and fix your failures so you can move on even at a faster pace? That's, like I say, kind of more of the startup, smaller businesses. Or is it a business that they want to make sure that any changes they make is not going to ever end up with issues in production? So an example like that is, we want our banks to be secure, right? And so we want a slow process in a bank. We don't want to change things drastically. And so they will veer, when you get into that type of security like a bank has, then they veer towards that more documentation. So finding the right balance is going to be important on your networks. So what kind of documentation should you have? Well, one of them, I'm not going to be able to cover everything here, but one of them is a network map. And there actually is a couple different kinds of network maps. So let's just talk about those different types of network map. You have one that is a physical network map of how buildings are played out. So here we've got building A, B, C. We've got an annex over here, and how the annex gets connected through this wireless connection, and they all connect into this core switch. So we've got now this campus area network. We've got a network map for this. This would be called a physical topology right here. This is the physical topology and how it's set up. But there's also virtually how we have things set up, which could be different. For instance, virtually, we may have this network that's for administration. We have a network that's for operations, a network for sales, a network for servers. And how that plays out is maybe, for instance, sales is both in building A and building C. There's salespeople in both those locations. And for operations, there's people in building B and C that are for operations. So the two maps of these could look very different between these. And this is a physical topology, and this would be a logical topology, how it logically is set up. So this is a logical topology. So network maps is one of those things that one of the things I do when I get into a new business and they have all these jacks around, and the problem is if you don't know where all of that equipment is and how it's set up, when there's an issue, it makes it really hard to troubleshoot. And so one of the first things I do is make sure that I understand what the network is like and start developing my network map, so that way when things go down, I know how to troubleshoot it. So this is a very important one to make sure you have on hand. Another one which I've mentioned in another video and I'm mentioned in this video is the baseline configurations, establishing a baseline for how things are set up. Because if I am taking a look at a piece of equipment and I see some sort of pattern with it and I think, oh, that looks suspicious, I have no idea what it looked like before. So what we do is we capture a baseline configuration. The baseline configuration is going to be a capture of what the device looks like. Maybe it's the performance in the case that I'm giving, the example I'm giving right here. It's a performance capture of the performance, so we understand how the equipment has been operating. So when something goes awry, we can compare it to that and see what the differences are. So the other thing I have in here is the configurations. You know, if something goes awry and something's different and I can't find what changes have happened recently, I may need to pull out the old configuration file of how that looked and compare it to the new to see if something has changed recently. So that's another part of this baseline configuration, is I would want to capture the configuration of my different devices. And I even have a method of when I go and make changes to my different devices, I have kind of a method so that I capture a new baseline every time I make changes to that device. So I've created some documentation guidelines based off of my experiences in the past. And you're not going to see this on any test or anything like that. So I've just come up with this, just some guidelines that when I'm creating documentation, how to make it more manageable. So first of all, one thing you have to do is keep it organized, because if it's disorganized and in different spots, when something goes awry, for you to be able to find that documentation, it could be hard if it's not organized. So make sure that you are organized. And one of the places I stepped in, which was struggling at first, they had documentation in all different spots and stuff. And so that's what we did, is we organized it and put it all in one spot. So that brings us to the next one. Limit the location of documentation. So there are lots of different ways to store documents in lots of different formats and lots of different locations that we can put it in, and different technologies that we can put it in. And if we are using all of these different types of storage, then that can be problematic as well. As how do we access this? And once again, where do we find it? So that can be problematic. I do end up in quite a few locations just because I want passwords in something that's secure, that's going to store it encrypted and not going to give access to everyone. And then there's some documents I want a little bit more dynamic, so I want it on something like Google Docs or Microsoft Office 365, or something that's going to be more dynamic so everybody can take a look and see what's adjusting in it. And then a lot of my documentation is on like a Wikispaces, Confluence type of setup, where you get on and you create documents of your workflow, or documents of the different systems. So I do end up putting it in multiple locations, but I try to limit that as much as possible. So as much as it will allow me to limit it. Make sure that you have access to that documentation in the case of an outage. There's times when I've had documentation on the hardware that, like, maybe it's on the virtual hardware. Maybe I got some virtual hardware that's operating in this virtual machine cluster, or maybe it's on and then I lose access to it. And then how do you troubleshoot? So however you're keeping this data, make sure it's accessible if there is a network outage, and consider maybe having 2 locations for it. This is a big one for me. I do not have the same information in multiple forms or multiple documents, multiple locations. Just try to keep one kind of central place for that information. So an example of this is that there are times when there's issues at work, and I will create there's a report template that is filled out for those issues. Well, that's not always good for all of the people within the business. And so what happens is that this part of the business wants the report done in this format, and this part of the business in this format, and this part of the business in this format. And then you end up with 4 different copies of the same piece of documentation to meet the needs of each one of these locations. And that generates a lot of extra work, and it also creates confusion. And then when things get updated, they don't all get updated. They're going to get off. Documentation gets off. That's one reason why you perform audits, because you want to make sure your documentation is accurate. But if you've got 4 different locations, all 4 of those locations is going to end up having different information. It just happens again and again and again. So, so for that purpose, I say, well, let's just create one form, and then within that form, somehow we got to call out different sections to meet the needs of these different people. But I'm pretty adamant about that, about let's not have multiple copies of that same information. And then I have on here, backup that documentation. Make sure you have a backup of that documentation. Once again, make sure that it's accessible in the event of an outage. So steps to documentation, pretty easy. Let's determine the type of data that you need to store, whether it's those baseline configurations or backup copies of things, or maybe it's the network diagram, or it's a system diagram. So somehow determine the types of data that you want to that you want to collect. Identify the devices that you're going to collect that information onto. What devices do you need baseline configurations? What systems do you need all mapped out? And then establish durations. So in this case right here, for instance, if you're doing a baseline configuration for performance, that is going to have, there's going to be durations for that. Are you going to perform the duration over a period of a couple hours, a couple days, a couple months, a couple years? Well, probably not a couple years, but there could be different durations that you're going to establish to configure to figure out what the baseline is. And then you'll have to figure out how to refresh that. So when to update those baseline configurations. So yeah, make sure you go through to actually take a conscious effort of identifying what type of documentation you're going to have, where it's going to be located at, and identify the devices, the durations, when to update it. Think about through all of these. And then one thing that has to happen is everybody on the team has to be on the same page. Since this is documentation, has to be on the same page, because they have to be everybody has to have a common understanding of how to access this documentation and how to record the specific information. And I'll go through with my teams and make sure that they understand what their expectation is and where to find that documentation when they're onboarding, and then even on a yearly basis, to make sure we're all on the same page. There you have it. So in this video, we talked about why document. We talked about some common network documents, such as the network maps that we have or the baseline configurations. We talked about some documentation guidelines, things that I've found that over the years that's really important to implement when you're doing documentation. And then we wrap things up talking about the documentation steps. Very important. Don't overlook documentation. It's not the top priority. It's certainly not the top priority. But what happens because it's not the top priority is a lot of times it gets put on the back burner, and you should definitely not do that. It's way too critical to put it on the back burner. I hope these videos are really helping you out. If it is, could you hit that like button?